Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Hi, it's Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so to continue on our emphasis when it comes to the modern empire on the history of global unity, we'd like in this episode to be talking about the global British Empire, and then move on to talking about the United Nations, and then give a little sneak peek of what we have when it comes to the United States of America. So, in our last episode, we talked about the Catholic Church and essentially what we've been calling the Catholic Empire as a an empire that sought to emphasize a spiritual unity, but aside from simply being a religion that gave spiritual guidance, showed how you must live, and the consequences of not living in a certain way, the Catholic Empire exerted its influence beyond just the religious. It brought in political power um, through the appointment of leaders, through dividing different empires, and then it would go on to exercise military power, most publicly exemplified through the Crusades, which could cost the lives of upwards in some estimates of millions of people. So, again, in that episode, we talked about what was really a spiritual unity, which turned into a spiritual empire. So, in this one, we're going to be beginning with the British Empire, which we would like to see as the first real global empire. So, with Britain, it was, again, not simply restricted to the island of Britain, what we see is the UK or, things of that sort. It had colonies in Asia, it had colonies in Africa, in some aspects, it had colonies in the America. It was all throughout the globe. And this was a global empire that essentially previous leaders such as Alexander the Great wished they could have dominion over all aspects of the world and now the known world, because due to the age of discovery, Europe would come to discover that the Americas existed. And now, with that aspect, empires had much new land to conquer, to control. And with Britain, it would come to do so in a very effective and a very distinctual way, in which we'll start to describe in this episode. So with that, Khalil, I'll let you start off with some historical context.
All right. So, to begin, the idea that the British Empire is an empire, and even the term British that we're talking about, because, Wales, Scotland, England, Ireland, you know, they're all different places, they're all different regions within the wider United Kingdom. But even and so like in 1707, you had the link between Scotland, Wales, and England called the Act of the Union. And then in 1801, you had the link between Britain, which is the name for England, Scotland, and Wales all together. You had the link between Britain and Ireland in what would be called the United Kingdom. And so I just felt for whatever reason the need to clarify that. But even before England connected officially with Wales and Scotland in 1533 under the reign of the very infamous Henry VIII in his statute in restraint of repeals, kind of a written document that is very similar to what the US presidents do today, kind of like the State of the Union, declared that, quote, that this realm of England is an empire, end quote. And so, um, like you have the first mention. This is in British history, or English history, whatever term you want to use. Gets complicated sometimes. The first time that it is referred as an empire and not just a kingdom. And then as we move further on into the centuries, and like the time in between, we might feel the interest in explaining in this episode, or we might not. We don't know what we might say, but we also will talk a lot more about British imperial power in other episodes and other sections of this wider series, the Modern Empire. But um, as Britain developed, and as it grew into a colonial power, it was always a naval power, being an island. But as it became a colonial power, it became a naval force. There was a point during what is called the Pax Britannia, 1815 to 1914, when Britain was unchallenged at sea and adopted during that time, during the Pax Britannia. There was 99 years, the role of global policeman in a very similar way that America assures itself it's that responsibility now, because as we talked about during the last episodes of Peace v Freedom, um, that Spider-Man quote that we always hear, that we might know, even though you don't know that it came from Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility, can be applied to even geopolitical and historical affairs. That nations, very powerful ones, they once they have enough power, they have the responsibility to act in certain places to keep the peace or to ensure the freedom of certain peoples. Now, we're talking about in this series how certain empires like achieved that in different ways and in better ways. We spend a lot of time in Peace v Freedom talking about that. But during the Pax Britannia, during the first truly global empire, the global British Empire, they adopted the role of global policeman, which was later adopted by the UN, through the very United Nations factor of it. It's in the name, it's meant to be global, as well as the American Empire of Influence, which is also global in nature. So, um, um, with the British Empire, they adopted a certain foreign policy called splendid isolation, but because the intricacies and the details of that term are a little more complicated when you look at, within its own colonial territory and territory that isn't part of its colonial territory, and places that are part of Europe and places that aren't. Different policies, like different places had different policies in the point of view of Britain, and so there's an importance to just move away from the term of splendid isolation to just calling it the balance of power, which is really the best way that you can look at British foreign policy during this time and a bit before, going back into the 1700s and 1600s. The British foreign policy of balance of power was very much what their time as of the Britannia or Pax Britannica being known as. So, there's another thing about the balance of power that I wanted to point out, and that is that for Britain, during this time when it adopted the policy of balance of power, whether it be in the continent or globally, a small nation in Europe or an unconquered non-European state would only stay independent and free of direct control by outside powers because of balance of power. Like, it was the only reason a small nation in Europe like Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, would stay independent, or an unconquered non-European state like Ethiopia, China, Thailand would be independent, was because of balance of power. Because like no nation could take it and um, and uh, and prevent itself from becoming too powerful, to abuse that power and then bring the continent or the wider world into war. And that's when, in 1914, it failed and brought about the First World War. But that is a topic for another day. Um, in sum, when we talk about the balance of power strategy, which is what the British Empire needs to be looked at through that point of view, um, like it again, like it's a very pessimistic point of view when it comes to a foreign policy. It's very different than America in the sense that America and the UN, it's a liberal, they're liberal empires in the sense that a nation is independent because it deserves to be independent. A nation is independent, because the people wanted it to be independent. And there's no purpose in letting it not be independent anymore. That's the
Yeah,
policy from 1914 onwards, and especially from 1945 onwards when the UN was established and World War II ended. But yeah, back then, during the global British Empire time, the balance of power reigned, and a nation would only be independent. A small nation or a non European unconquered state would only be independent because it was convenient.
exactly. Essentially, with balance of power, the big boys are basically the ones who are running the scene. The British Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, even. They are the ones who have the most power. They have the largest navies, the biggest armies, the most politicians, the biggest economies, so on and so forth. If you're a smaller country in this sphere, essentially you're not relevant. You know, you don't have a big army. You don't want to have a lot of resources. You're not really allied with either side because you're not really important. And as Khalil pointed out, it is a very pessimistic point of view on when it comes to foreign policy because all it says is that whoever has the most power, the most um, armies, the biggest navies. You go modern, who has the most tanks, the most airplanes, the most nukes. They're the ones who are really the only things that are important, the only ones who can dictate how the world works. And that's simply as World War I, World War II, and the founding of the United Nations would basically show that doesn't work. Other nations exist, they exist for their own reasons, and they can choose whether or not they want to be quote unquote relevant or not. Any country, by being a country, has its value. And that's a very liberal idea when it came to the idea of nations and states, as if every simply because you had the largest navy doesn't mean you were the only one who could set the rules. But essentially, that was how Britain ran things. The balance of power meant that the big guys could duke it out. They could decide what they wanted to do, what rules for trade, whichever that sort. And if you weren't part of, either side like that, eh, why are you even there? And so essentially with Britain, that was how it came out. That is how Britain related to the external forces of its empire. So the countries and the empires that were outside of itself. So again, the British Empire was its own, but if it was Russia, that is how, it would be dealt with through this balance of power. But when it came to be more internal, this is where Britain's idea of direct control and sometimes even more indirect control would come into more of a greater effect. So with direct control as the name, or not exactly direct control, but divide and conquer, which is essentially their way of directly controlling that, it would be to insert themselves directly into the influence of whatever colonized land or territory that they would have taken. Sometimes that would mean they'd appoint their own leaders, they would appoint their governors, they would send their soldiers, they would set the rules. You could worship this god or you couldn't. You would pay up our say our wheat or our resources demands, or you might get killed. You were forced into slavery, and that's just how it was. You or the British Empire in this aspect, when it came to the colonies, in the divide and conquered sort of aspect, they were the ones who set the controls. They set the rules. It was essentially a balance of power, as if the natives or something were another power, which, in comparison to the technological advances of the British Empire or any sort of colonial empire, they just weren't. And because that was the only thing that was important, notwithstanding, the rights or the value of people at hand, they were it was certainly not relevant because it was the power of the military and the power of the military and the rules to set and enforce the rules that they have. So, okay, I'll keep going with this one. So, with another aspect of how Britain ruled internally within their empire was a sort of informal, indirect rule of kind of British control. And for this, we have a quote that we'd like to share. So, their informal empire was really a sphere of influence over a region or a country that wasn't directly ruled as a colony or vassal state. So this is as contrast to the British going into a country or an area, setting up their governors, setting up their own people, and setting the rules on their own. Um, so in this informal sort of empire, it was their influence in the region, not directly ruled as a colony or vassal state for commercial or even military interests. So in a 2010 article, um, Gregory Barton and Brett Bennett defined an informal empire as, quote, a willing and successful attempt by the commercial and political elites to control a foreign region, resource, or people. The means of control included the enforcement of extraterritorial privileges and the threat of economic and political sanctions, often coupled with the attempt to keep other would-be imperial powers at bay. For them, the term informal empire to be applicable, we argue, historians would have to show that one nation's elite or government exerted extraterritorial legal control, de facto economic domination, and was able to strongly influence policies in a foreign country critical to the more powerful country's interest. End quote. An informal, this is continuing on with that. An informal empire then may assume a primarily economic guise. Strategic considerations or other concerns might bring about the creation of imperial influence over a region, not formally a component of the empire. So essentially, what we have here is another aspect, another global aspect of the British Empire, in which it sort of conquers lands not by military or direct rule, but by the economic domination of a country, by it being, say, the sole trade partner, or by having companies in that country that were dominating the market and simply funneling the resources back to the mainland. So again, it describes another aspect of the British Empire in which, it was conquered through both military and direct means, as well as political means through negotiations or often unfair treaties, along with economic power. And the British Empire, traditionally favored direct rule, but it wouldn't exclusively use it to meet its primary commercial interest. And because of that aspect, when it came to commercial and economic means, it would do so just as we described, through more informal means, through being um, for having more companies be the ones setting the rules, by having those companies send the resources back to the mainland. A big example of this, obviously, the East India Company, which wasn't exactly, the British military going in, but it was a company that had extreme economic domination, sometimes even its own military component, and could serve the interests of the British Empire while not exactly being the direct British Empire, ruling over land of that aspect.
Right. So when we talk about balance of power, um, and how it can be applied to territories inside British control, um, it is again, as you mentioned earlier, Chad. It is more or less under the term divide and rule or divide and conquer. So as you mentioned with that quote, that is an example of how, like an informal empire that is mainly economic is able to exert power for capitalistic commercial interests in territories that would eventually be part of its empire. Like the East India Company had a monopoly economically within India and other places that would eventually come under British control within Asia. And it was only until around, I believe it was 1857, 58, around the time of a really big revolt in Britain, I believe. I mean, in India, forgetting the name of that revolt, but it was around the time that the East India Company showed that it wasn't strong enough to keep the 400 million people of India, under its thumb, that it eventually came under British direct control. But that didn't mean that it didn't that beforehand wasn't able to exert a vast amount of economic control, because economic leads political, and political is enforced through military. Economic is a kind of an incentive to which you gain political power. And that's what the East India Company was able to do very well, as an example, with India and nearby places under British dominion. But it was through that political power that it gained from its economic interests and its commercial interests that it was able to finally force it in with its own regular military in the second half of the 19th century. So that is the way in how Britain was able to kind of use commercial interests in its own capitalistic desires and commercial interests to take over territory. That that using private companies, for example, in India was the first step, and it was only until that didn't have enough of a heavy hand militarily, for example, that it was able to bring it in officially as the final step of control. And so that's one way. Another way is how they would use the native population and their leaders to be able to bring the territory into their own fold. Like the British Raj is a good example. But but they did this in just about every colony that was under British control, whether it be in Africa or anywhere else. They would put native people in power, but not through democratic positions. They never want to give power to the local people to decide who is in control, because then it would delegitimize their power, as they would very rightfully assume that if the local people had any democratic say in who led, then it wasn't going to be the people that they wanted to then to lead, being them. Um, and so rather than bringing in, you know, like their British white face, for example, to Africa or to India to lead, you're not like they weren't going to do that. They were going to support, for example, the monarch of the places that they were going to control. And that's why in the episode that I had, the roundtable discussion I had with Sanjeev, Robert, and Marty, three of my former teachers back in high school, we talked about the importance for a colonial imperial country to rule another territory through monarchies and through appointed positions. The moment that your colony becomes democratic, at least in the old imperial way of doing things, you basically lost all your power, because you would prove that the people did not want you there through any election you would ever allow to happen. And so, what the British would do is that they would find, for example, the king of uh, of whatever place they wanted to conquer. They would notice some geopolitical position or some internal domestic position, and they would find some way of getting support from the monarch. And then the monarch would sign some treaty that allows Britain to put control into the territory. But that king would govern in the interests of Britain, and that falls within the definition, as you described, Chad, of the informal empire, and that's something that Britain was able to master very well. And so we up until this point, we've been talking about Britain, and Britain is very interesting, but everything else we have later to say about it is to be brought to later. So for now, let's talk about the United Nations. Chad, you have anything else to say about Britain, or do you want to move on to UN?
About Britain, just about that last thing that you said, if they had any sort of democratic rule or allowed any sort of democratic tendency to survive, that would never be extinguished. The fire of freedom would never be extinguished. And those people, if you ever give them the power, the the power to represent themselves or make their rules themselves, any sort of them any sort of authoritarian empire would crumble because the power given within the people, the power to appoint their own legislatures or themselves to be rulers or to decide themselves to be independent nations would never be extinguished and is never allowed and just does not work with an authoritarian system that seeks to suppress any sort of direct or independent rule. And so this is where the idea of liberalism starts to sprout out under the thumb of some of these empires. Empires that, again, as we'll be talking about in later episodes, begin to crumble as these fires of freedoms begin to pop up. But I agree. We'll save a lot of that for those last episodes. But we'll be moving on to the United Nations. Um, Essentially, the framework of a unity of mankind under the guise of international law, international equality, and the idea of liberalism.
So one of the first things that we want to talk about with the UN is is actually something that comes before the UN founded itself, and that was with the League of Nations. When we say that the balance of power method failed after 1914, it's because World War One started. All the alliances that were built up, all the power projections of certain players weren't enough to stop war from starting in 1914, which is something that I want to talk about later on, maybe in a roundtable later on at some point. But anyway, um, the reason why we say that at 1914, like the balance of power ended isn't just because World War One started. It's because once World War, because World War One, it's because when World War One ended, there was a new way of bringing peace to the world. It was no longer the pessimistic model that big nations would decide the way how the world was governed and how a small nation or a non-European state would only exist because it was convenient. The world was moving beyond that idea in the post 1918 world. And it was through that the idea, very revolutionary one that again needs to be given credit for the post 1918 world after World War One, is that after this cataclysmic apocalyptic war, you know, the way and how the world was governed for decades, centuries, would move into one that was built upon dignity of nations that at the time didn't even exist. And so you allowed people to decide who would be part of their nations, where the borders of those nations would be. And that's part of what the Paris Peace Conference was all about. Again, another topic I want to talk about for another day, which had its own problems, but it was very significant for the time. And it was the way and how the world would be governed um, in where the ambition of Woodrow Wilson and the victorious powers of World War One decided that there would be a global council of peace called the League of Nations. It was the prelude to the United Nations, in where nations would settle their disputes and where the borders of a nation would be decided through referendums, not through war, through dialogue, not through conflict. Um, but it failed because it didn't have the teeth. And so, and so when Mussolini, Tojo, and Hirohito as the emperor of Japan, and Hitler, when all of them, and even Britain, and other Western powers, when they broke the rules of the League of Nations, no one was there to stop it. The League of Nations did not prepare for the idea that somebody would break the rules of international law, which is why international law as a way of governing the world is very optimistic in a way that the British balance of power policy was very pessimistic. And so moving into to the United Nations, let's start with the Article 1 of the UN Charter. And Um, and I'm just
Yeah,
gonna read it out. And Chad, why don't you and like you can you we can comment on it after I read this up right now.
for sure.
Quote, to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts and aggression to other branches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace.
Yes. And so what we have there again is the found essentially the guiding notion of the United Nations. It is a level of international peace, of international law, international equality, all under the guise of essentially what is a global sense of liberalism. That is, that nations itself themselves can exist because given the respect and the powers that we say we the individual have, we have the power to determine for ourselves what is our nation, what is our country, how we want to rule ourselves. And so with the United Nations, what you really have is a space where all nations are on the same status, regardless of their military, spiritual, or economic power. This is a space where aspirationally it is not bound by the restrictions of the balance of power by the British Empire. There are no more irrelevant countries. All countries are relevant by means of their existence and by means of the laws that the United Nations and the founding members and the world have really agreed upon. Things such as self-defense, um, and other ones of that effect. But in the UN, again, guided by this guiding principle, all nations may participate and cooperate and work to remedy essentially the ills of the world. Again, a large departure from the balance of power in that everyone is involved. It is not just the big players, it is everyone. And, as we'll talk about in later episodes, it doesn't always turn out to this aspect, but that is, again, we'll talk about that later. But aspirationally, what the premise of the United Nations is that it creates a sense of international unity in that all nations, all states, all peoples to some aspect can participate in the system, which again is not a nation, it's a conglomeration. It's greater essentially than the sum of its parts in that it is the world united, the nations united. It is the power again is from its people or from its nations. And in this system, all people ideally have power. It was described by Winston Churchill around the time of its founding that, quote, the United Nations is the only hope of the world, end quote. The United Nations served as it was founding around the end and after the end of course, World War II, as a way that these again, apocalyptic world wars could be prevented. We did not have to kill around 60 million people in order for our results to be solved when we could meet at a common position as equals and come to an agreement that we, can do without conflict. And this is a global unity that, again, unlike the British Empire and ones before, did not involve conquering, would not involve um, influence, say, on a spiritual level. It would be with the mutual respect of the law, respect of each other, respect of nations that would allow these countries to come together after so much war to be able and have an avenue in order to achieve peace. And so, with that, I'd like to talk about a little again about the founding of the United Nations, because in its founding, it sprouts from an idea of not just not just a way of simply imposing a liberal order after the war is over. It branches off into what we see it now as a place for this international respect, this international equality. Whether it's effective again is up to debate. So, the United Nations began with was originally called the Atlantic Charter, which in 1941 was an agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom for their plans on how they wanted to see the world um, after World War II was to have ended. And again, what's of note is that this is an agreement between the US and the UK before the United States joined the war. It was in August of 1941, before Pearl Harbor, while the US was arming Britain, but we had not ourselves decided to involve ourselves in what we saw as a European conflict or something of that sort. So, in the Atlantic Charter, as described by the US Office of the Historian, quote, both countries agreed not to seek territorial expansion, to seek the liberalization of international trade, to establish freedom of the seas and international labor, economic, and welfare standards. Most importantly, both the United States and Great Britain were committed to supporting the restoration of self governments for all countries that had been occupied during the war and allowing the peoples to choose their own form of government, end quote. And so here you see some hallmarks back, similar to the League of Nations as Khalil described it, as a way of dealing with after the war, of dealing with the new idea that people can decide themselves to form a government, to form a nation, to form what they see as their laws, how they should work with their neighbors, and it no longer being decided by, again, the big powers at play. Now, it's no longer the world of the balance of power, because with the end, or with the start of World War One, that is, it showed that the balance of power simply did not work, as quote unquote irrelevant countries could spark a war that killed millions and millions of people. This Atlantic Charter served as, quote, the promise of a world organization based on universal moral principles, end quote. And this is found in the United Nations website itself. But it underscores the influence that liberalism had and the aspiration that the United Nations had of being a universal avenue for global unity. It would serve as a place where all these nations could come together under the common and essentially universally held ideas of mutual respect, self-governance, and things also the effects of international trade, freedom of the seas, and other things that were found in the Atlantic Charter. But with the aspirations of founding the United Nations, it showed how it had the aspirations of being a universal global unity, one where, again, as I described before, where nations could come together on the same terms and figure out their differences without having the biggest tanks or anything to that effect. Khalil, is there something you'd like to add?
Yes. One thing I wanted to point out is that when the U.S. Office of Historians says that the Atlantic Charter served, quote, the promise of a world organization based on universal moral principles, end quote, as you mentioned, that it is highlight on universal. It's only one word within that small quote there, but universal. When we're talking about what the United Nations would be built on, we're talking about an organization that is built upon principles that are universal, like state sovereignty, that are talking about freedom of peoples, peace, the interest of peace, that we're talking about a universality of moral principles in the way in how people would be treated and how nations would be treated. um but no, but I have to point out that universality, because that is so much of what I'm bothered by when I look at the news and I hear Putin or Xi Jinping or Khomeini talking about any group of people that decide to protest against their government being supported by the West, or being used as like imperialist pawns of the West, because like because freedom, you know, peace, dignity, human rights, those are no culture doesn't support those things, and maybe there are certain cultures that accept collectivism over individualism. No culture doesn't support dignity, human rights, freedom, peace, and if you do, then that's the dictator colonizer talking, like the inner dictator, inner colonizer talking. Because anybody that convinces their people that those things are the ideals of the enemy, the ideals of the person that wants you weak, want you weak in and of yourself. So that's one thing I wanted to point out.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, often it will be dictators when it comes to, say, Russia or China, saying that those ideas that you want of freedom, of, say, equality, self-governments, anything like that, are simply some plot of the West to destroy us. By doing that, they're justifying their own authoritarian rule. They are saying that the freedom, the universal quality, the universal striving that we've had as humans of free will at all, and wanting to exercise that on a political scale, that all of these desires that you have are simply some sort of brainwashing of the West, some sort of influence campaign that had never existed within our country, to um, in order to destabilize this or anything of that sort. All three of these big countries, such as China, Iran, or Russia, have had massive pro democracy protests in the last couple of years, um, have claimed that they are simply being brainwashed to the West, by the West, that all these protests are popping up because the West is sending in their new ideas of freedom and self governments, which simply did not exist within our countries before. By dictators and things of that sort saying that freedom didn't exist in your country before, that it's not part of your culture, is essentially saying that these things that you want aren't universal, that this authoritarian rule that the dictator is imposing upon the country is simply just how it is. And by using a scapegoat such as the West as the avenue that these new ideas are being brought, that they're simply being manufactured, it's a justification that while these three countries say it now, it won't be surprising if some of the smaller ones in some other countries who follow along will start to say the same things, that, oh, all these protests, all these influence things, it's simply the West, it's simply them. We don't have a culture of freedom in our country, and therefore this way of ruling is simply how we always are. It's basically a justification for keeping something authoritarian and stamping down um, any sort of democratic striving, because that's, quote, not how it's been. It's not how it's been because you haven't allowed it, and that's what those authoritarians and those dictators want you to think. They're demeaning your own culture for their own personal power. They're saying that the culture of that country just doesn't have the capability to govern themselves. It doesn't have the want to govern themselves. And that the rule that we have as the dictator or government, um, is just how it is. And you should accept that or simply admit that you're just being brainwashed to the West. And I know, Khalil, I think you have some stuff you'd like to say to this as well.
Yeah, I can never shut up about the universality of those moral principles because all three of those nations, the three biggest threats to America, are also the biggest threats to the wider world. I mean, come on, if you all in the same year, you have massive pro-democracy protests, or actions against their government, then you then you cannot claim that you are doing things the right way. And if the only reason those protests didn't topple your government is because you had to throw in your military, and again, these people are protesting not just like they're not like
They're
they're
not
not
protesting that their government didn't agree with the United States on the EU or something like that. They're
right.
protesting because they don't agree with this way of government, this way of governing. that's not you can't really claim that if you're claiming that what freedom is a Western idea and not a human idea, you're essentially demeaning someone's humanity. That your desire of freedom and free will is what an idea of the West that was invented in the past, what, 70 years? It's nonsensical, honestly. And again, it's just used often it's used as a justification for authoritarians to keep it how the way it is. And I agree, it's definitely worrisome as it's will be used more often. But looking at the truth of things, you're right. The universality of these qualities is true. The universality of just the desire to want freedom at the very basic aspects and to have the ability to make life how you want to make it, whether that's serving in government or buying your own house. Um, those are some aspects of things that, just the freedom of that is something that we desire as human beings in our free will. And to be denying that is to be denying some aspect of our humanity. And all too often, that's what those dictators seek to do.
Right. So when it comes to the UN, we 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 talk about what it was meant to do and talk about what it was built upon and how it was different than other systems before and how it was revolutionary. But as we did with Begin the World Over Again, um, we we will talk about how the UN is almost failing because at least with China and Russia, and to a certain extent, every once in a while, even the U.S. from times, and Britain and France, the permanent members of the Security Council are undermining the system from within, and this system every once in a while it needs a push. If the UN General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to do something, that to fight against something that is unjust, whether it be to end the embargo on Cuba or to end persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, to end Jim Crow in the south of the US, or to end the invasion of Ukraine, you know, then, or to stop Iran from making a nuke, like all those things, then the world would be better off. If those things could be done, cannot be done with the current system. And so every once in a while, it needs a push. And as we mentioned in Begin the World Over Again, America is the best country to do it. And since it is a country, it does have its own interests. It's every once in a while, its interests may not be the interests of the wider world, but it's the best option. And as it is right now, it's the only option because it's so powerful.
Yeah. With international law in existence as a way of global unity, the United Nations sometimes it falls short in how it's set up, as we've described, and we will describe in later episodes. Sometimes it falls short, and by them using the manipulations of its rules, it becomes sometimes an inhibitor of progress and not an enabler of such. And as Khalil said, sometimes in order for international law or human rights, or some would say even freedom, to be enforced or to be enacted on the world, it needs a push. And as we say here, and as we've said before, we'll say later, the United States is the best equipped country to do so. And as we'll describe it a little here, but we're going to save a lot more in later this series, so we hope you stay tuned. But America, it serves as a liberal empire, an empire of the sense that people have their own individual freedoms. And when it comes to the sense of internationally, that those freedoms should be protected. And sometimes through military force, as it has done, the United States enforces that on other countries. And again, sometimes it's for bad, but sometimes it is for good. And we'll be able to describe it later. But the United States, again, is a liberal empire, which in doing so seeks to bring a global unity under the idea of liberalism, which takes in the effects of the universal qualities and things that we strive for, such as freedom, some would say self-reliance, but essentially the freedom to make the world and our own governments to our own making. But yeah, we'll preview a little bit of America, but we'll continue on in some of our later episodes about it as well. But um, some of the ways that the United States has continued, or at least taken on the reign of some of the sort of like a global unity has been through the ushering in of the nuclear age. As we all know, the United States was the first one to develop the nuclear weapon and to use it, which ushered in another sense of global unity, which could be argued to be the existence of nuclear weapons. If you watched our series on nuclear deterrence, you would see us argue and how nuclear weapons serve to keep the peace among those nuclear armed nations, given the just death and destruction that a nuclear conflict can hold. And so, with that, some could argue that the nuclear age itself is a sense of global unity, or at least a global sense of peace, given that conflict can often break out. And so, with that, we'd like to use a speech, and I'll let Khalil piggyback off of this once I finish off with it. But we have here a speech by Hirohito in his surrender speech on August 15th, 1945, and how, of course, nuclear weapons can end the world. So I'll begin with this as quote, Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. But also, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of Powers. We are keenly aware of the inmost feelings of all of you, our subjects. However, it is according to these dictates of the time and the date we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by, enduring the unavoidable and suffering the unsufferable. End quote.
So again, we already talked about the context of this quote with the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater with this series of were the bombs on Japan in 1945 justified? You can find those first two episodes. You can find those two episodes very early on in our releases back in July, I think it was, of last year. But this quote, which we read off in those episodes then, has a newfound meaning with this series. That when it comes to global unity, we are being strangled by the fear of nuclear annihilation, and so we have the responsibility not to use them. Now, what that means at times is that by not using nukes, we use our military, which can bring out war, or it can has the opportunity of bringing about peace. Because if you do anything to undermine the sovereignty of our nation, being, let's say I am the leader of a nation, then I will nuke you to high heaven. So nuclear age is the enforcer of global unity in that sense, um, almost guaranteeing, in a sense, that the world will never go into nuclear war. Now, whether that means that can prevent conventional war is a completely different question entirely. And obviously, as you can tell, if you are a Ukrainian citizen right now, it cannot. But that is the ups and downs of the nuclear age, as well as the failure of international law, that something like that can happen in today's world. So there's actually another quote. Albert Einstein, he discovered during the 30s, as well as other very notable scientific minds, that there was a possibility that a nuclear weapon could be developed. And And as Einstein began to suspect from his own discoveries that it was possible um, that the Nazis, who were growing in power at the time during the 30s, would develop their own weapon. And that's why, after escaping Nazi Germany as a Jewish person himself in 1932, immigrating to America, he sent over a letter in 1939 to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time about the possibility of a nuclear weapon being developed by the Nazis. And in that sense, even though America wasn't in the war, there was an importance on his part that this be approached with urgency, as it is important for global peace, that the Nazis not be the only nation with a bomb, or not be the only ones with this nuclear weapon. I think we can all imagine what the world might be like if that was the case. And so um, Albert Einstein arguably was the person that brought about the nuclear age, if you look at it through that context. But then, interestingly enough, kind of like Oppenheimer, helping to build this weapon and helping to bring about this age once it was used and once the UN was developed, um, he had a he had a bit of an epiphany, and when he realized how dangerous it was, and when he actually sent a letter over to the UN, or as it was known then, the United Nations organization, and sent it to the Secretary General for review, um, talking about how um, like the nuclear age justifies global unity and justifies global cooperation. And even as he would allude to the elude the fizzling out of national borders themselves. So, quote from his an excerpt from his letter: "For as long as atomic energy and armaments are considered a vital part of national security, no nation will give more than lip service to international treaties. Security is indivisible. It can be reached only when necessary guarantees of law and enforcement obtain everywhere, so that military security is no longer the problem of any single state. There is no compromise possible between preparation for war on the one hand and preparation of a world society based on law and order on the other." So, end quote. So, in the first sentence, he already lines it out. He says that as long as nukes are involved, no nation is going to listen to things like international law. That's what you see with Putin right now. Like, my God, Putin is actually like proving why Einstein is right, in this quote, um, like foreseeing actions that would take place almost 80 years after he wrote this letter. And it's not like Putin would be the first time that any leader would use nuclear blackmail in that sense. I mean, there have been other times, but there's just this fear that nukes will dominate politics and undermine international global peace, um, but at a higher stake than ever before in human history. So when he says that no nation is going to listen to international treaties for as long as they have nukes, that suggests that not only should nukes not be part of the question, but it assumes that that it suggests that, is it just me, Chad, or does it suggest that there should be no nations, that there should be global governance?
I feel that it suggests more so that the existence of nuclear weapons undermines the very idea of a global equality, an international equality or unity based on that forth. Because it basically what Einstein is starting to say here is that by giving the power to nations to essentially wipe each other off the face of the earth, it gives them a reason not to pay attention to treaties. So what if all the other countries say that what we're doing is bad? we can erase them. It base to some aspects, I think some could even argue that it reintroduces the idea of the balance of power, but the balance of power of nuclear armed nations. Because as long as those countries have their nuclear weapons, what is stopping that? What can stop them besides, the very convincing them of their very end? Because at some aspects, they don't have to listen. Because a conventional war could be stomped out by the use of nuclear weapons, and the use of nuclear weapons is the end of the world. So I think it's a really interesting quote that Einstein has here in the consequences that it has for global unity. And that while we have the United Nations as the aspiration for an international order based on international respect and the concept of nations in self-governance, we have on the other hand the factor of nuclear weapons, which could be seen as something that undermines those, and reintroducing the balance of power, but of those nuclear armed nations, which can now become once again the relevant countries and let the others be ones to sort of pick up their scraps. But just looking at our grander topics, these are conversations that we will be saving for some of our later episodes, and when we talk about the falls of international orders, and we touch on more on the United Nations, the United States, and how their orders respond to things such as the aspect of the idea of nuclear weapons, and if and how global unity survives under these systems that may or may not work. Um, so, Khalil, is there anything else to add as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I found the connection to global unity with this quote, and that is that if a nuke were to be used, or nukes were to be used for the sake of national security for any nation, then that means that the response to that should be a sense of global belonging and doing away of national differences so that no nation or the people of any nation or leader of any nation would see themselves as any different than any person around the world. It was a desperate appeal, but it was an appeal in and of itself that Einstein made um, after World War II, at the beginning of this new age of what was considered to be unchallenged international law, of unchallenged dignity of nations, and peace and freedom for the nations and people of the world. Um, but you know, that sense of national belonging, there is an argument that new developments like the rise of technology help um, to uh, um, to strengthen that global belonging, that places and where technology has grown, like in the global north or in developed nations, do have a greater sense of globalism, of international sense than places that don't. But that's just a theory. That's something we have to get into later. Um, but when it comes to nukes, there is a fundamental understanding that for as long as nukes are given in possession of nations, and nukes are used or not used for the sense of national foreign policy, or national security, it undermines international global unity. So that's with the nuclear age, it complicates that because there's a lot of what ifs, there's a lot of different ways of interpreting things, and people are very different. You have different people leading these countries, different philosophies, different ways of provoking and keeping peace, that people that someone of another nation may not agree upon. And that's why during the Cold War, you know, the world nearly ended. And that's why right now we might be heading into a new one. And so, with global unity and heading to the end of this episode, we just have to hold our breath and hope that the nuclear age does not end the world that it was hoped by Albert Einstein, um, um, and you help to unite. That the rise of nukes happened at the same time as the rise of international law. You know, to unite the world or to destroy it. So that's just one thing that we wanted to point out, and another thing that we can end on with this episode of global unity on our series of modern empire. So I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad.
and we are the Morsels of Truth.